Now it's left to a lawyer to come and pick up the details, the boring details that need to be picked up to actually make these things happen. So you're going to have to go from wonderful broad speeches to some lawyerly details. But I'll claim a little bit of credit for myself over here by the fact that my mother has worked in Indian craft for 60 years and my wife is French, so I think I'm well placed to bridge the gap between both culture and France. To Nicolas Gross, who spoke earlier before the speeches about the FTA, I agree that the FTA is a game changer. I'm here for the footnotes. So perhaps some subjects for the dialogues that Nicolas mentioned, and perhaps to say some things that our French friends in the room are too polite to say, but that Jean-Marc Jamet referred to in passing. So I won't talk about what the FTA is going to do. I'm going to talk about what the FTA will not do, and what the other things are that India needs to do, which is within our own hands, in order to push the India-France relationship and at no cost to the exchequer. So I'm looking at collaboration, I'm not looking at deregulation. India can't and should not lower its standards. On the other hand, we are at a deregulation moment in India with initiatives like Jan Vishwas, which is confidence of the people, that are aimed at ease of doing business for all businesses in India, not just those that involve foreign investment. So the FTA takes care of tariffs. Let's look at some of the friction that sits behind the border. As Madame Epine reminded us, a tariff schedule does not create a market by itself. Some of the friction that the French maisons deal with is behind the border, and the issues are different for different categories of brands. First, let's just look at the example of the EFTA with Switzerland, which gives us some live proof that liberalization and opening up tariffs actually changes behavior. It came into force in October 2025. And Swiss watch duty, which was at a base level of 22%, is phasing to zero in 7 years, is already down to 15.7% after 2 cuts. And the Swiss watch industry now calls India as one of its fastest growing markets already in the last 1 year, not even a year. While its 2 biggest markets, China and India, are under pressure. So let's look at the 4 areas that matter the most. And as I mentioned, we're talking about recalibration and not deregulation. So there are 4 things that we can do unilaterally. Let's start with cosmetics. So my tagline over here for my soundbite over here is that lipstick does not need the same level of scrutiny as antibiotics. In India, legal changes in 2020 gave cosmetics their own regulatory rules, which was a good thing. But the primary legislation that cosmetics operate under are still the Drugs and Cosmetics Act of 1940, which was written largely with the much higher levels of risk that are posed by medicines, and has the same regulatory framework. So while the rules were separated and are more liberal, the institutional instinct of the Act and the regulator that administers it is still geared towards the higher level of scrutiny that is required for medicines. So what happens as a result of that is that getting a perfume or a face cream approved for sale to the public can sometimes feel almost as onerous as clearing a pharmaceutical product. Registration is required product by product, site by site, through a mandatory Indian agent. Timelines can run into months and can restart with each shade or variation that you have, which is unworkable for an industry that works in seasons and product launches and not in terms of months and years. So we're quite aware of this. A bill to replace the 1940 Act has been pending since for the last 4 years and needs to be brought back onto the legislative agenda. So it's worth backing this law because it contains a risk-based approach to cosmetics and not a compliance-based. So in other words, you produce a product, put it in the market, and if it causes risk, then you'll pick up the regulation afterwards, as opposed to doing all the approval upfront. It will completely change the game for this. This is what the EU or the US does. So safety is enforced aftermarket, not via pre-clearance of every product and product variant. So we expect that if this is put into place, approval processes will go to 30 to 60 days as opposed to several months as they exist today. Also, to look some adjacent wins would be not duplicating quality control orders, which put a second layer of safety after the cosmetics themselves, and maybe anything that we want to do in relation to quality control can be put into the cosmetics rules themselves. And perhaps we don't have we have a dual use no objection certificate for agents that are used both as cosmetics and drugs. Perhaps that process could be simplified. At this point, I'll just do a slight diversion and say that I know that the ambassador who isn't in the room now, he agrees with a lot of these things and is aware of a lot of these things. And there is action that is beginning to take place, but I would encourage anyone with an interest in this, whether academic or business, should sort of look at pursuing some of these things. Let me move to footwear and leather. What's happening in footwear and leather is now QCOs, quality control orders, now require footwear in India to carry the BIS or ISI mark, which requires BIS to certify the overseas factory where that is made. Now, this was intended originally with a very, very good objective to prevent mass Chinese-produced footwear from coming into India at low quality and wiping out our own footwear industry. It, however, doesn't apply to an exclusive shoe made in a Parisian atelier, and perhaps we need a different process for this. And again, the ambassador, at least for certain, and people sitting in Delhi understand this. And if we can think of an approval process which is two-track, where low volume, high value products are regulated differently, we perhaps get some different outcomes. Indian customers, ultimately, we have to remember, are reassured by the brand. They're not reassured by the stamp of approval from an Indian regulatory body. Nobody needs to be told that Birkin bag is sort of approved by an Indian regulator. That's not why they're buying it. We have this. We also could accept some EU conformity standards, which are very high and which European companies already are conforming to under the FTA's technical barriers to trade chapter. So there's a route for us to actually do this in the next few months. And where necessary, we can perhaps match some of these audit frameworks where you have to have audits. We can match those audit frameworks to the fashion calendar. It's not hard to do with a little bit of insight. Let me move now to the third topic, which is single brand retail, and how we could change sourcing from a hurdle into an incentive. Now, the rule is that 100% FDI is allowed, but beyond 51% ownership, 30% of procurement must happen in India. First, let's acknowledge that some progress has been made. Global sourcing from India does count. There's 5-year averaging. If you produce in a special economic zone, that counts as well. So pragmatism has already been shown. But the structural problems for heritage maisons in France is that the product itself is the provenance. So a Sèvres or Limoges made object cannot be 30% Indian sourced without ceasing to be itself. It loses its own existence if it's 30% Indian sourced. So as a result, most of the world's most famous brands will still enter India via franchise licensee agreement or by investing less than 51%, so they can get out of the requirement, which means there's a thinner presence of these brands in India. They're not as committed to India as they would be if they were there with 100% investment. So here's a potential refinement. Let any investment in Indian craft count for a brand that is a provenance-based brand. So the sourcing of embroidery, of components, ateliers for global collections, or artisan training-related investment, let that contribute towards that 30%. This will convert what has become a compliance test to the supply chain outcome that we always wanted to have with this 30% sourcing in India. And now let me move to the most difficult issue, the issue of wine and spirits, where, if you ask me, the reducing of tariff is just the first step. And the reason for that is that wines and spirits are regulated at the state level in India and are one of the only sources of revenue left for the state governments at the moment. So unless the states move somewhat in line with the central government, we are not going to be able to realize the benefits that we would like to get out of free trade agreement. So here are some things that the central government could do. One is come up with a model excise framework which different states could adopt. Very often we found in other areas that the central government comes up with a set of guidelines and even leaves them open for voluntary use by states. States will pick it up. At least some states who are aligned with the central government will, and that good habit then will spread. And people in India travel a lot now, so you want to see the same rules in different countries, so they were in different states, so there would be some pressure coming from the market as well. And perhaps you could have a voluntary clearinghouse for brands to be registered. At the moment, every variant of 2022 vintage versus a 23 vintage needs a separate registration. Perhaps we can look at some collective registration, again coming through voluntary rules that the central government frames, and then we put pressure and hope that the states will adopt. And finally, I'll just talk about fiscal signaling. It will be really good. Luxury today is at 18% GST. It will be really good if our government resists the temptation to increase that on the basis that these are things that rich people can afford anyway. The rich people who can afford these things will travel overseas and buy them elsewhere, otherwise, which is what people have been doing forever. So why should India do this for importers? What's the benefit to India? Which, whenever you do a policy intervention with the government of India, they'll ask you what's the benefit for the country. And it's an absolute fair question, and I think an essential question. So my answer to that is that many of the French luxury brands, the potential importers that we're talking about, are already amongst India's best exporters of craft, as we've heard all afternoon. We've heard about Chanakya, we've heard about Dior at the Gateway of India, and there are many, many other examples. So you are talking about helping today the people who are potentially the best ambassadors of Indian craft export. If you make their life easier in India, if you allow them to broaden their base and presence in India, they are going to just use more and more Indian craft and expose it to the world. And as Mr. Jamais said, that enabling environment is not a concession to foreign brands. It's like almost like an import-linked incentive. We like production-linked incentives in India, but this is an import-linked incentive. We allow people to import; they will have deeper engagement with the Indian market. And we've already heard about how many jobs potentially can be created. 45,000 for LVMH in the US, 25,000 in China, 300 in India. Just look at, these are decent paying jobs in air conditioned comfort. Continuing with the theme. There's also a halo effect over it. This is very low cost diplomacy for India. And again, the ambassador completely understands this. Luxury punches above its weight in terms of its percentage of the trade statistics in the public imagination, both in France and in India. LVMH and Hermes are amongst Europe's most valuable firms, and their CEOs' views on India count in French boardrooms and with the French government. So when Dior does something at the Gateway of India, that probably did more for India's image as a sophisticated, creative, investable economy than many official campaigns have in the past. So, on the other hand, if there's a Birkin bag or a 2,000 euro pair of shoes which is stuck in customs because the factory is awaiting approval through an audit, that's also a story that travels and unfortunately carries bad news. So, getting the luxury relationship right is going to be, proof that the FTA's promise is real, and otherwise it could also de-risks the whole Franco-Indian economic relationship by creating that enabling environment in India. So the FTA opens the door. I think some of these 4 reforms that I've been talking about decide how many people will walk through that door. None of these forces India to choose between protecting our artisans and welcoming French maisons. The maisons are already the artisans' most high value products. So our opportunity is to make the partnership easy, light, visible, and very profitable for both sides. And the timing is ideal. The reforms that we're talking about domestically are in line with India's deregulation agenda at the moment. So we can act now, even before the entry into the force of the FTA. Thanks for listening.